I have been watching presumably the same movie that many of you have been watching, where history gets ever more absurd. And in any case, I've started to focus on this issue of consensus. And I know our listeners will have heard me say several times, there are two versions of consensus. There's a version of consensus that's the natural version, where something that may start out perfectly heretical becomes conventional wisdom because the evidence for it is overwhelming, right? This is a very natural phenomenon. We've seen it with all kinds of things: jumping genes, germ theory of disease, plate tectonics. These are ideas that have become standard by virtue of the fact that no matter what they sounded like at first, they became unavoidably recognized as true because of all the evidence. That's the normal version of consensus. And in fact, I would say it's what we mean when we say the word consensus. There is some other thing masquerading as consensus that requires intense coercion, right? And the point is, it is almost the exact opposite of consensus. If to say that plate tectonics is the consensus in geology is to say that it's so obvious now to us that everybody besides some fringe believes it to be correct, then the point is you can infer from the degree to which we are all converged on the same conclusion that it must carry an awful lot of weight. It doesn't make it true, right? It could be invalidated by something we would learn in the future. But it means that basically a person with the current best toolkit will arrive at this conclusion by virtue of what happens when you feed the evidence into the analytical software. Well,
that's exactly it. If I can just interrupt for a moment,
Sure.
It's that the weight of the evidence, prior evidence and new evidence that arrives fits with the model that is plate tectonics. And what you don't have whenever you invoke plate tectonics, and this is a slightly weird example for us to be using because I've never attended a geology conference. I don't know what actually happens there. But whenever anyone invokes plate tectonics, there aren't a tiny number of people in the room presumably going, yeah, but what about the right? Like, what about the evidence that it's not what you say it is?
Right.
Right.
Well, and there's a delicate. First of all, I should say I also have never been to a geology conference, though I'm completely confident it rocks, but hey, good. That did not elicit a glare. I feel I got away with it. All right, but the point
Grimace,
is,
maybe, but not that one.
The implication is that the evidence that somebody who is well equipped in this area, given the evidence, will arrive here unless some radical new idea that better explains the evidence, as we say, either explains more or assumes less while explaining the same amount. Either one of those things will do to displace plate tectonics or any other hypothesis that becomes a theory by virtue of the evidence. But the consensus implies that this is the theory. It's as close as we get to a fact, right? That this is the theory that accounts best for the evidence that we see and assumes the least, right? The consensus implies that. But presumably, everybody gets that if we said, well, what is the consensus amongst these rocket scientists, that rocket is safe enough to get people to the International Space Station in one piece, right? And if you saw that there were people standing behind each of them with the gun, right, and they all swore that rocket is safe enough, you might say, well, I don't actually know if the rocket is safe enough. I know I heard every rocket scientist on that stage tell me it was, but I also know that they may not have been free to say otherwise. And so the very fact that you find intense coercion surrounding a claimed consensus is in and of itself reason to be worried, to slow down and say, what don't I know? Would the conclusion of the scientists on the stage be any different if they were actually liberated to say whatever they thought and there was no negative penalty that would come to them other than the reputational risk of saying something out of step?
Yeah.
And so, did you have something you wanted to?
Well, I've forgotten. This is going to be a little messy because I thought I had the notes and I can't remember. There was a podcast that we did this week that was really, really wonderful. And I'm not going to remember any of the particulars and I'm embarrassed. Maybe while you're talking, I'll look it up. It's not out yet, but the host who we were talking to is a pilot, and he said that some of the reason that flying is so safe is not just because regulations in the U.S. from the FAA and such are intact and useful, but actually that the culture is one in which you don't just have and again, this language isn't quite what he said, you don't just have the right to object when something seems to be going a bit amiss, you have the obligation.
Obligation to challenge, I believe.
To challenge. So you don't just have the right to challenge your superior, you have the obligation to challenge anyone if you see something that doesn't seem right to you. And this is, a consensus is a consensus if there is not just, certainly if there's an obligation to challenge, but you at least bare minimum need the right to challenge. And to be left then with a sense of like, okay, is this consensus? Can we hear from the people who object? Do we know what fraction of the people in the population actually have challenged this?
Right. And actually, it's a great example. Not only is it implicated in how aviation, or at least commercial aviation, has become so incredibly safe, but the exceptions to the rule, the places where commercial aviation has not been tremendously safe, very frequently show the pattern where the obligation to challenge is overridden. Right. And so he had an example of an accident, which I actually can't recall which accident it was. But I immediately came up with two. I have a long-standing sort of passing interest in aviation, and Bob Trivers, our undergraduate advisor, wrote a famous paper on self-deception in which he used the crash of the Washington, D.C. Flight into the Potomac, I guess.
Yes.
As an example. And in that case, the co-pilot had understood that they did not have sufficient speed to generate the lift necessary to take off, and being outranked by the captain overrode him and they plunged into the water. Yeah. There's another example in Tenerife where a very famous captain who not only formally outranked everybody, but because he had been featured in commercials for the airline and was, the go-to guy, got impatient with the tower and overrode them and just started his takeoff, not seeing that there was a plane parked halfway down the runway. Anyway, the point is the obligation to challenge is the safety factor.
Yeah. So let me just plug this again. It's our episode is not out, but this was Dose of Leadership with Richard Rierson, in which he says his leadership interviews with today's most relevant leaders. He's terrific, and this was a really great conversation.
Yeah, I thought it was a great conversation too, and I was super impressed. I'd not heard of him before, but I was very impressed with the depth of his thinking, and his interview style was really. It's Indeed. A podcast I'll be paying attention to going forward. But in any case. So all of this is beginning to gel, and I don't know how likely it is that the public is going to figure out what's going on, or that they're even, they're so incentivized not to figure out what's going on that many who see it may simply keep it to themselves. But a number of things happened this week that I thought were noteworthy in this regard. They may seem unrelated at first, but hey, Zach, could you put up that Zero Hedge article? So Zach is going to put up a Zero Hedge article reporting on, just out of luck, a friend of ours, Colin Wright, biologist, who had content removed from, I believe, Instagram and Twitter this week. And the content in question was a paper that asserted that males and females are not equal on average with respect to strength and therefore their capacity in sport. Now, this is a fact. This is not controversial, or at least it would not have been controversial 3 years ago, 5 years ago. This is a fact, and anybody who said otherwise would have been a person of the fringe. Now, you can make other hypotheses. You and I have both heard really stupid ones, like, the males are keeping the food from the females, and therefore the females are not developing the strength that they would otherwise develop. That's a
good one.
That's a valid hypothesis. It's just wrong, right? It's demonstrably
it's patently
wrong.
Laughable.
Right. Well, it's patently laughable, and it's easily falsified because you can control for this. You can simply say, in circumstances where we can demonstrate females have equal access to food, do they still end up on average not as strong? And you will, of course, find out that they do. You will also find out that the evidence from other species reflects this pattern in those species in which males displace other males in competition for mates.
It's the millions of years of unending patriarchy with no gaps at all in any culture at any moment.
Man,
hypothesis.
Would I have loved to sit in on the early multicellular life meetings of the patriarchy. That would have been interesting.
Did they not take notes? I mean, don't you have access to those back issues effectively? No?
Encoded in the genes somewhere, possibly. But in any case, the absurdity of removing this content is obviously remarkable. But what is even more remarkable is the basis on which they claimed that they did it, which was under their hate speech policy. Right? Now, this is not only absurd, the very idea that a factual claim at all, even if it was wrong, a factual claim based on a scientific paper that says that males are on average stronger than females could possibly be hate speech, right? This is a discussion of a matter of fact. So,
well, I mean, I think if I were to try, I'm not Steel Manning. I can't do it. But if I'm going to try to understand what got them to that's hate speech, it's going to be the trans activists having compelled some number of people, and again, not the vast majority of the tiny number of humanity that's actually trans who wants to be left alone already to live their lives, but the trans activists who have decided that sex is the same as gender, and that how you feel about what sex you are actually changes what sex you are, and so the idea that, and this is actually I'll save it for the what I call it this week, and the absurd and the atrocious or something. One of the examples is exactly in this framing, but it attempts to obliterate the, depending on how you count, 500 to 2 billion year old differentiation between the two sexes, as if the opinions of some modern humans has any say in this.
Has any say in it. And what's more, even if you were to take that Steel Man, and I think it's about as good as you're going to get, but even if you were to take it and then you were to go out and ask people purely on the basis of whether they felt male or female to lift as large a weight as they could, right, you would find that those who arrive at the conclusion that they are male by virtue of how they feel rather than by virtue of what gametes they produce or what chromosomes they have or any of those other factors, you would still find an overwhelming correlation, right?
Yeah. So it's also a misunderstanding of statistics and mistaking individuals for population level differences.
Right. Mm-hmm. But the thing that really irks me about this is there's a way in which those who ostensibly are attempting to defend some vulnerable group very frequently rob the people who need the protection most, right? Mm. So for example, if we just decide that any transgression by a male against a female of any sexual nature, right? Everything from a cat call to, a tap on the tush or whatever it is. If we just say that this is all equivalently horrifying, mm-hmm. then we are in fact robbing people of the protections against the most serious stuff, which would be something like rape. Right. So the point is either there has to be an ability to deal with the spectrum of indecency, mm-hmm. or what you're effectively doing is transferring protection from rape victims and potential rape victims to people mm-hmm. who don't like the way they're being looked at. And the point is, no, the protections really do belong concentrated against the most horrifying behavior. No question about it. So don't you dare reapportion them, right? And in this case, what we're doing is we're actually, by boosting something factual into the realm of hate speech, we are actually now robbing the category of hate speech with we are robbing it of the ability to declare something false. Right? The idea that something is abhorrent and false and that would be a necessary precondition to it being hate speech, right? We're not turning this into an arbitrary category. That is an insane degradation of the concept to the extent that we all understand that there is something called hate speech, that it may be very difficult to deal with it because of First Amendment protections, but it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. We've all heard it. Right. So this is a matter of utmost insanity. And the reason that this circles back around to this other topic is that the degradation of the term hate speech is actually an exact analog for what they have now done to the concept of medical misinformation. Because just as hate speech now apparently can contain facts that were uncontroversial, a few years ago, the concept of medical misinformation is obviously no bar to discussions of things that are the result of scientific evidence that suggests a conclusion. They're in fact forbidden in the YouTube terms of service, right? You can't say certain things. It doesn't matter whether there's a scientific paper that says, hey, this is the conclusion. You're not allowed to talk about it on YouTube. So that destruction of these categories, right? Medical misinformation really ought to mean, hey, this is false, right? And hate speech ought to mean also, this is wrong and vile, right? The fact that we are going to destroy these categories in the pursuit of I don't even know what is utterly frightening.
Yeah, I think that we are going to be returning to this topic of consensus next week. I have some things I've been thinking about with regard to what all conditions render something a consensus in medicine land. What we're seeing right now is a very particular, and frankly, this should be super obvious to people, that a consensus that is arrived at quickly, behind closed doors, we've said this many times before on this podcast, right? A consensus that is arrived at very quickly, in which there are claims being made that could not possibly be known because the nature of the time span is such that you cannot know, for instance, what long-term effects there might be. Quickly, behind closed doors, in which there is no ability for outsiders to assess the analysis done, in which only the products of the behind closed doors conversations are presented with the sort of props of science. Someone has the relevant degree, someone is wearing the relevant lab coat or has the glassware, right? This is then taken to the populace, who are told to follow the science. Right? This is follow the rapid consensus that we are cloaking in science. It's different from following science.
Right. It's not following science. And what they really mean is follow the science or else.